Good morning, everybody.
Oh, there's a clicker up there.
I am David Payne from the UK, as you can probably tell from my accent. What am I saying? I don't have an accent. Americans have accents. So it's a great pleasure for me to welcome you to this symposium in honor of Professor Paulraj. These are what I call designer conferences. So when we honor one of our new fellows, we give them the opportunity to have a designer conference which they are deeply involved in designing. And that's what we have today. So I'm really looking forward to it. So with that welcome, it's just down to me to introduce the moderator for our first session, which is our Emeritus Chairman of the Marconi Society, Bob Lucky. Over to you, Bob.
Thank you, and good morning, everybody. I feel that we're among friends here, and that maybe it would be more appropriate to introduce the audience to the speakers rather than the other way around, because there are a lot of experts and friends out there, and it's good to get this group together this morning. And as moderator, I intend to do probably nothing other than be a timekeeper for the four experts that we have here. You know, I was thinking, when Marconi first invented radio a little over 100 years ago, and what a miracle to be able to send messages through empty space, or they thought ether then, And I thought, there's so much of this ether around, there's an infinite amount. We got as much of this as we could ever use. And then as the century went along, people said, wait a minute, there's nothing left. We used it all up. How do we get more ether? And there are a number of things you can do, of course, and spectrum policy is an important part of that, and here in Washington particularly. But I mean, in getting more ether, as it were, and there are technical things that you can do. You can move to higher frequencies where there's more bandwidth. You can go to smaller cells so you get more reuse of the frequencies. And you can squeeze more out of what you got. You can find better ways to get occupancy higher of the bands that are relatively unused now. But this panel is going to concentrate on what technologies can we do to get a lot more capacity from existing bands that we have. I mean, they're there, and people think they're used up, but we talk about how much more can we get from these things. And so we have four experts that can talk about this, and we'll have about 20 minutes each. This is not going to be so much an interactive panel as it's going to be a set of four speeches, but we will, whatever time's left after they've finished, we'll take some questions and have some discussion. But these guys have a lot to say, and I look forward to hearing. So we'll start with A.J. Paulraj, our newest fellow. In fact, he's so new that he's not a fellow yet. Presumably that will happen tonight, unless there's a nuclear attack on Washington or something like that. But we look forward to having him join the Marconi family, and we'll see him tonight. So anyway, Paulraj, Emeritus Professor at Stanford, and one of the real pioneers of MIMO, the big technique that is so popular these days.
Dr. Bob Lucky, and ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor to be the first speaker this morning. Welcome to the Marconi Society and to Washington, D.C. MIMO wireless is the topic of my talk this morning, and I'm going to sort of talk a little bit about the key ideas, the enormous theoretical research that went around it for the past almost two decades, and something about the impact that's happening on today's wireless systems that we all use. So let me first begin with a tribute to Guglielmo Marconi. I never get it right. So as a young man, at 18, he actually demonstrated the wireless telegraph. And that was, I think, the range of all of 150 feet. And in a matter of 7 years, the range had risen to 1,500 miles. So it's a compound annual increase of 500% in range. And today, even doubling per year, of course, is phenomenally difficult, and we still manage to do it in some areas. He had a 500% range of wireless transmission. So a remarkable engineer, inventor, and a scientist. So of course, this is my favorite slide. It came out of my Broadcom days. So wireless is everywhere. So and little would a Marconi realize how impactful it will be. And even if you go back 15 years, we could never imagine or dreamt that wireless will be everywhere and so much a part of our lives. So it's a wonderful area to work in. It's a great privilege to be a part of this research area, as well as the privilege to join the Marconi Society. So let me begin with the concept of single antenna wireless communications. If you have a single antenna transmit and that receive, the capacity of that system was laid out by Shannon. I'm being a little sloppy in my notation, but the capacity was given, it was really the throughput you can get without errors with the right kind of coding was B, the bandwidth, log of 1 plus P, the power, transmitted power, and L is the path gain, or the gain of the system, including both the antennas and the transmission loss. Usually L is very, very small, 1 by billion to 1 by trillion, divided by noise power. So if the path loss, or L, was fixed, then of course the capacity was a fixed number. So we're familiar with this idea. So, but when it comes to wireless, we have another phenomena of fading because of multipath, presence of multipath, and some other artifacts in wireless communications. The actual path gain fluctuates, sometimes above the mean level and sometimes well below the mean level. So if you're looking for a reliable capacity that's guaranteed at some level of reliability, for example, at 95% reliability, then that capacity is much lower than what would be available without fading. And for fading, therefore, drops the guaranteed capacity, and therefore it's in some sense an evil. But of course, it turns out fading is also a big positive, and we've been able over the years to exploit it in some interesting ways, but I won't get into that today. Now, the question therefore fading was definitely a problem, and the person to first look at it was again Marconi. It turns out in his transatlantic transmission from I think Cornwall in Ireland to or in England, southern England to Newfoundland, Halifax, Newfoundland, he discovered that there was fading in the link, and if you had two antennas spaced apart, you would find the fades in one, it may not fade in the other. So the idea of diversity. And by combining or selecting between these antennas, he could actually mitigate fading. So Marconi discovered the concept of received diversity back in 1904. And therefore, if the fluctuations that you see up there in the slide, right-hand slide, I'm not sure if this works, the fluctuations reduce, therefore the outage capacity or capacity guaranteeable at, say, 95% improves. So that was a big positive thing. So let's go back. And now, what about, therefore, antennas that receive was a key to diversity. Antennas that receive are the key to diversity of one form. Now, clearly, if you come back to, if you put antennas at the transmit, here too, the links from the transmit antennas to the receiver could fade independently or near independently. So it should be able to capture diversity. Surprisingly, it was such an obvious idea. Getting it to work took many years. It turns out it took almost 90 years before the first ideas began to arrive. I think in 1990, Wittneben in Zurich first proposed a scheme, and Tarok, Nambisha Shadri, who's here, Calderbank, and others wrote about this phenomenon, about this approach to do it. But the real blockbuster came from somebody called Siavash Alamuti with this orthogonal code, which is put down there in the right bottom of your slide. And some very interesting stories how he discovered it. But nevertheless, this was a clean way of getting diversity. And it finally became, it's part of every phone and every Wi-Fi system we use today. The important thing to understand about transmit diversity is that you're still using the same power as one antenna. So you have two antennas, each antenna only half the power. We have four antennas, only 1/4 the power each. So transmit diversity was really discovered, I think maybe a little earlier in 1998, but the paper came out in 1998. So the question is, we have transmit diversity, you have antennas that transmit, antennas that receive. You could put them together, you can get perhaps even more diversity. But an idea which came in 1992 offered a very different opportunity. And that was that if you have antennas at both sides of the link, you could actually get more capacity. So I sort of put tilde up there for capacity of C, because of fading, the capacity is moving around. But if you have two antennas that transmit, two antennas that receive, you can actually get order of 2 times the capacity. And the key how it works was, suppose you had an orange antenna and you're sending a data stream on the orange system, it would induce a signature at the receive antennas. And if you send another data stream in the same bandwidth on the green antenna, it induces a different signature. Signatures are gained in phases at the receive antenna array. And then the receiver could then figure out there's a difference spatially between the streams and can put all this back, separate them, put them back together. And this was first proposed in 1992 by a partner who came out of Stanford, which showed, this is the figure 1, which shows how you can do this so you demux a stream and you put it on antennas and you put it all back together. So you might say, what's big about twice the capacity? We're used to doubling many things every year. So and of course, 2 antennas, 2 by 2 was twice, you have 4 by 4, it's 4 times. But what's so remarkable about it? Well, let's look at this phenomenon and see what happens. So if you have a link, 1-by-1 link with a certain amount of transmit power, I'm assuming the link loss and the noise power is the same, so P, transmit power is what you can play with. And let's say we had a capacity. Now, we have a 4-by-4 link, and we are still the total transmit power is still the same P, so you have to divide the power across the antennas. And let's assume, for example, the capacity will be 4 times. Now, let's set this problem where the modulation order is 64 QAM, and SNR is 20 dB. It turns out that now you can ask the question saying that if I want to get the same 4 times capacity in this 64 QAM format, which is very common today in wireless. Wireless actually now has gone to 1000 QAM in Wi-Fi. Broadcom, I think, has chips out or will be out soon. So 64 QAM is still modest. The question can be asked is, how much power do I need on a single antenna link in order to get 4 times the capacity that you can get with let's assume 1 watt on the 4-by-4 system? Well, the answer is more than 256,000 watts. And if you go to 1000 QAM, which is also becoming in practice today, the differential value of 1 watt with 4 antennas, you need 1 billion watts on 1 antenna. And we go to an 8-by-8 system, which is also going to happen maybe in 3 or 4 years in Wi-Fi. You require, for 1 antenna, all the power and all the grids of the entire world in order to match what 1 watt can do on 8 antennas. So it is a remarkable value. And what it really says is getting capacity is very hard. And antennas give us a way of getting capacity. Of course, from the original idea in 1992, many questions had to be answered. For one thing, you had antennas on both sides, so the concept of diversity, which is not really fleshed out in the multiplexing idea is also present. So combining diversity and multiplexing turned out to be a very interesting area. And then, of course, the idea of understanding the capacity of the system, characterizing many, many issues around it, and the complexity of decoding and so on and so forth, brought in literally thousands of researchers, well over 1,000 PhDs. But it all started with two remarkable people, Mike Gans and Jerry Fischini at Bell Labs. And they wrote the first papers around 96 and 97, where they offered a system called BLAST, a way of coding the system so you could realize its potential properly and where it would capture all the diversity in the system. The original ideas, 92, didn't actually capture transmit diversity. It focused only on receive diversity and the multiplexing gain. So this attracted lots of many people, many of them pure mathematicians, and much of the mathematics that finally came out I can't understand, but involved very interesting areas in group theory, and so it's a phenomenal area of masterpiece of mathematics. Over the decade from 1995 to 2005, there were thousands of papers. Today, if you Google the number of MIMO papers, it's more than 14,000. Advancing. What's going on? Sorry. Some problem with the any help here?
It's fancy down there, too.
It's down there.
Yeah, so if you look down there, you'll see where you are.
I don't, if I had a point there, where is it talking to?
The MIMO transmitter. Yeah.
Going backward.
Okay, so keep going.
We'll work this out.
Probably need another
Your 20
battery.
minutes could get up here, I don't know.
Seems
Obviously, the clicker needs MIMO.
I know.
yeah, just don't put your hand in front.
No, not work. Okay. Well, so from single-user MIMO, it's a very small conceptual leap to say what happens if you want to send streams to different users. And that became called multi-user MIMO. You could send, say, multiple streams to one guy and a single stream to another person. And a simpler version of this idea was called SDMA, which came out actually out of Stanford too in the 1990s. But a more generalized thing was called multi-user MIMO. And that began to happen about 10 years ago. Okay, and then it's another simple conceptual leap to say that instead of the antennas being compact at the transmitter, you could put them out, you can stretch them out, you can put them on different cell sites, and sometimes called distributed MIMO. And this is, it's already, these things are already being used, and so distributed MIMO is also a phenomenon that we use today. So in terms of MIMO, where is it today? Certainly, it's in cellular, in 3G and 4G, and in certainly Wi-Fi. And it appears as single-user MIMO, and for example, your Apple Air laptop, I think, has a 3x3 single-user MIMO system. And multi-user MIMO is just about, it's already present in LTE. I think current technologies implement 2 users simultaneously, and that should increase slowly. But Wi-Fi has already gone to 11AC Wave 2, where we support 4 users. And I think the chips there are just becoming available, will be available very soon. And the distributed MIMO is also not yet showed up in Wi-Fi, but showed up in LTE, where it's called COMP, where the antennas are at different cell sites, and they're coordinated in order to give you the idea of multiple antennas, multiple spectrum. But to go back to the fundamental ideas of using diversity and multiplexing, it turns out all this very advanced mathematical work finally didn't impact practice. Practice is dominated by two key ideas. For diversity, the Helmut code, and for multiplexing, the simple multiplexing code. And the reason for that is that when you want to combine diversity and multiplexing, the decoding problem becomes enormously complicated. So even today, chip designers don't want to go there because you've got to entangle the bits. And apart from the fact that mathematics gets really complex, the decoding problem becomes extremely complex. So still, even though you have two antennas, it's called matrix A and matrix B, you switch between them. But if you have more antennas, you still try and use the same ideas in a simpler way to build these multiple codes. More complicated codes actually don't actually get much traction. Another phenomenon which I left off was if the transmitter also knows the channel. It turned out Jerry's work and my earlier patent didn't think it was possible or didn't address that problem. But you can actually know the channel, you get feedback, or use other techniques. Then it turns out that the complexity actually disappears. It becomes much simpler. But getting to know the channel at transmitter is always difficult. So in general, it's, the whole area is fraught with complexity and insights, is details and details and details. And it's really a miracle that we can all get this to actually work. Come on. Okay. Now, of course, what about, we talked about, typically a picture showed 2 or 3 or 4 antennas, but everything in MIMO, whether there's diversity or multiplexing, can go on to any amount of antennas. The ideas still work. So now there's a new move to sort of talk about large MIMO. It's called massive MIMO sometimes. The idea is that instead of limiting yourselves to 3 or 4 antennas, which today LTE does or Wi-Fi does, why not talk about hundreds of antennas? Well, if it's still in the cellular band, 2 gigahertz and below, this would require very large arrays and not really tower top type phenomena. You've got to build them into sites of buildings and so on and so forth. And of course, you can't have a 100 by 100 MIMO system because the complexity will be impossibly explosive. So you want to use multi-user MIMO where on the client side, you only have 1 or 2 antennas, and you are supporting many subscribers simultaneously. So you're going to get all the gains of multiplexing gain and the spectral efficiency. So you can have arrays on the up in buildings, talking to phones with one stream, or you can have talking to arrays on cars, for example, which in the car will then jump, you'll then jump from there into your Wi-Fi inside the car with multiple streams. Or you can go to higher frequency bands, this is called the millimetric bands, where there are lots of activity today. Ted Rappaport is here who's pushing this area, where in a small array of foot by foot or 2 by 2 by 2 feet, you can get hundreds of antennas and you can do similar things. Of course, there are complexity with propagation, but I think they're all very solvable. My last slide, let's hope this changes. We need to fix this. Okay. Well, what about, so MIMO was sort of, a lot of work was done around the wireless piece, the most exciting part. As I pointed out, the values seem to be immeasurable. But this idea is also going to be flown in, used in elsewhere. For example, you have twisted pairs talk to each other on links. You can get some capacity, but you put them in a binder, in a binding cable, they crosstalk, very much like antennas do in a MIMO system. So, and therefore, the capacity drops. And it turns out, therefore, you can do the same ideas that MIMO does in wireless. You can rebuild the capacity. So in DSL, this is called vector DSL. And power line in your home actually already uses these ideas, and fiber transmission in slightly different modes uses them. So this is MIMO spread into many such areas, including it's gone into radars, it's gone into MRIs. So the idea of using antennas or space is a huge phenomena, but still so much work being done. And finally, my last slide. So It's in billions of devices already, but I still think, given all the opportunity we have to bring the impact of MIMO, I think we're still at only at the beginning. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You made it sound very simple, and we engineers usually are good at making something, boy, this is tough stuff we did, you know? Lots of equations and stuff, so it's beautiful, a beautiful thing that has accomplished so much, and we thank you all. And I think your last slide was a good introduction to our next speaker, John Cioffi, who is known as the father of DSL, and he also has a Stanford connection, also a professor emeritus. I love that word emeritus. You know, it connotes two things, old and famous, you know, so. And you don't look so old, John, so I don't know.
Thank you.
But I'm sure he'll have a lot to tell us about getting higher capacity with these things.
The clicker.
Okay, there we go. Well, thanks for that introduction, and Paul, I'm honored to be here participating with you as the winner this year of the Marconi Award. When Paul first asked me to participate, he actually asked me to help organize, and then he asked me to present in this session. He said, could you talk about the wireline MIMO? And I promise I will talk about that, Paulraj, but I couldn't resist to look at MIMO here. You see the title of my slide. Many of you may think it means multiple input, multiple output, and I've changed that here. Many itineraries makes opportunity, so let me proceed, and I promise I will have a few slides on the vectoring as promised. But as Paul mentioned, the internet today is growing beyond the number of people in the world. There are about 700 million fixed line connections. Whoops. I see I have to hit this button over here. There we go. And almost as many private hotspots. This doesn't include the coffee shops and so far, so we're talking about people's residences and that. And family of 4 in the United States just a couple years ago had 10 devices on average, going to many billions of connections and devices. So it's a big opportunity for everyone involved in the internet, whether you're supplying equipment or chips or services. And internet customers are going to be affected by this, as Paul mentioned. But from their standpoint, what's a MIMO? Well, you know, it's probably something like a Disney fish, right? Finding MIMO or Finding Nemo. And what they would realize is if they were trying to their kids were watching that on Netflix, it got stuck while it's playing on the tablet. That's not a very good experience. And of course, almost everyone has those types of experience today. They may be confused by all the terms, whether it's fiber, G.fast, DOCSIS 3.1, and MIMO is kind of on that list, I think. What they want is their connection to work and to work well so that the content or application they're viewing works properly. And one of the issues that comes up, and I could do it in this audience, every time I give a talk somewhere, I ask people in the audience, have you had a problem watching video over the internet recently? And you get some, almost everyone has one hand up. Some people have two. They're so angry with it. So we've not gotten to the point where we have consistent, stable connectivity. And what's really important here is the tails of the distribution. So here for data connections, meaning implying anything but video, you'll see that the worst 5%, that's a threshold where the consumers start getting angry, start doing things, calling, complaining, dropping their service. So for video, it's the worst 1%. And this translates into just tens of billions of dollars in operational costs for service providers, application providers around the world. So you really have to look at that for stability in all of these approaches. And in fact, even FCC SAM knows, you'll see they put a report every year. If you look at that, they're only looking at averages or 80 percentile. So they give a kind of an A+ to everybody on internet service in the United States. But that's not really correct. That's a pass to the telcos who do know, and the service providers, the cable companies as well. They know it's in the tails. This is where all the action is in terms of internet connectivity. Percentage unstable internet, which is various things can contribute. The connection drops, you get packet errors, the speed is going up and down too quickly. Fiber, believe it or not, is not free of problems. Nominally, you will see as much as 16% of the customers calling every month on fiber systems, especially some of the early ones. It's not supposed to be that high. If you manage it a bit, you can get about 6%. Cable is about 20%, at least in the US. DSLs vary depending on the speed. The higher the speed, is the vectored or MIMO that I promised to talk about a little bit, initially without management, it'll be almost half the network that's having an unstable experience with their connection, albeit at a higher speed. You can get this down, but you have to do a lot too. And Wi-Fi, wireless are the worst of the set in terms of the stability of the connection. Is it working? You know, that 5% or more of the time. So, and again, these are based on these tails of the distribution from the 90th percentile to the 95th percentile. Speed variation, okay, is a big one. If you look at the Sam Knows report from last year, it's the latest one available, you'll get the averages, which tell you that the service providers are providing 80% of what they promised 80% of the time. That's good. No, it's not even close to good. In fact, it's a 2-to-1 ratio at the 80th percentile, 1.2 to 1 on the speed variation. But again, this is in the tails of the distribution. If you look at the Akamai report for the most recent one, it's actually 8 to 1, but they take 100% tile essentially overall when they do these ratios on a countrywide basis. They average that. DSLs, I can tell you, my own company manages about 80 million connections around the world. If you look at the 95th percentile, it's about 4 to 1. 80th percentile is about 1.3 to 1. But you see that number going up. And speed variation causes the customer to complain. It's not good to tell them they have up to some speed and then you get a gigabit one day and you get a few megabits another day. That's going to create a problem with them. What they want is consistency or stability of the connection. And sharing can be a problem. If you have a number of different things being routed all onto the same system, some are waiting while others are using the system, this can lead to happy and unhappy customers. And I think I'm having some of the same problems Paul was having here with the clicker, but hopefully we can get it to work. I don't know if the batteries are going on this. They're coming forward. Do I have to aim this? Paul, did you figure this out? I'm having the same problem. Whoop. Maybe there's just a latency in the system. Okay, so MIMO, I said many itineraries make opportunities. Well, you know, it started as multiple input, multiple output. And really what that meant, as Paul showed aptly, is multiple antennas. It's really often a single input and a single output system that's simply using many antennas. To do that, you'll see SIMO, the S is single, MISO, SISO, so forth. More generally, I say let's look at multiple paths, space-time, frequency, wire, or otherwise, and see what that means. So let me simplify a little bit MIMO and just give you an example. Wi-Fi could have done LTE or something else as well, but again, the clicker is freezing here. Try a little slow.
Might advance it out there. Can you advance it from there?
There we go. Well, several things came up at once here, but the idea is if you were to look at at a Wi-Fi system, let's say an apartment complex, you're going to get a lot of overlapping systems. You'll see multiple SSIDs come up. It's not unusual to see a couple dozen of these. In the 2.4 gigahertz range, there were only 3 independent channels there. When the 5 gigahertz spectrum was allocated, they went up to about just under 20 similar sized channels being available. And this system runs on a collision protocol. So if anyone tries to transmit at the same time in the same cell or in different cells there, or different overlapping coverage there, you get interference between the systems, and that reduces the throughput for everyone. So my oversimplified version of looking at MIMO is if you have a single antenna, the radiation pattern looks like a circle around the antenna. If you have multiple antennas, you can steer the energy in certain directions. You have 3 antennas, you might be able to get 3 directions like this shown. And if you have multiple antennas, On the receive side, you can actually, as Paul mentioned, add together the different beams and get essentially multiply the capacity of the system using MIMO. So keep those in mind, and that's been described by this. This helps with that problem I mentioned earlier, but the last point I'm trying to make on this slide, which hopefully would come up, you're increased by the number of antennas, but heaven help you if you're in that lobe and you're in another access point. Let's suppose you're a single antenna, somebody in your neighbor's apartment, and you're inside that lobe. You're going to get blown out by the MIMO system. These things have to be managed, okay? They cannot be just left to the box to optimize and do what it wants, or you will have tremendous problems in terms of coverage. I think this clicker is really gone here because I'm hitting it maybe 10 times for. Yeah. Okay. Good. So those are the points. Turn it. Okay. So let's talk about vector DSLs. Well, you could think of a twisted pair copper phone line or any kind of copper connection. They crosstalk. They radiate. They're antennas, and they can be viewed as antennas. And they actually do interfere with one another. So the basic vectoring concept, which was patented over 10 years ago at Stanford, is to look at them like antennas, put a coordinated device on one side, and essentially pretend that they're antennas and steer the energy, if you will, toward the energy for user 1 times the CPE1 or user 1's location, and user 2's energy goes to their location. And effectively, you can eliminate all of the crosstalk between the systems. Okay, this increases the capacity enormously for the transmission system. This is the basic technique that's been standardized and used by the ITU in what are called G.fast, G.vector standards. Those are the 100 megabit DSLs and the gigabit DSLs you may have been hearing about depending on the line length. This is how it's done basically as a MIMO technique in disguise used on wired connections. However, if you were to look at the spectrum of the noise from left to right here, increasing frequency, and this is supposed to represent amplitude, and you remove that noise, what happens is all the inside noise, this is the fluorescent lights, the hair dryers, the appliances, the TV sets, anything that's electronic in your house, is getting into the connections inside the house, and it's causing instability, my point from earlier. So these actually vectored systems need even more management in order to retain the stability of the connections so that you do get the promise of these higher speeds. And this is just a little thing I took from one of the standards groups here that shows you the length of the twisted pair connections. It gets smaller, you can go faster, all the way up to a gigabit per second in the 100-meter range of connections. So as fiber penetrates more into the network, the closer it gets to the customer, the more expensive it gets. What about those noises in the home? Well, they're still there, and they are not eliminated by this one-sided MIMO technique. And so what do you do with those coming in? Well, what you can do is look at that and create other antennas. And actually, my company sells a service that does this, and there's devices that are made available through others that actually create a multiple antenna system in the home. And you can knock out the noises in the home using MIMO as well. So it's kind of a new technique where the results are pretty spectacular on this. This is just a graph in the United States of the upper blue part shows you the line length and the range of speeds you get before and after you use this MIMO inside the home. These are on lower speed ADSLs where you can use it as well in it. So MIMO has its use in wireline. Now, one of the things that happens is, and this is convenient to service providers the world over, they hear that this requires coordination, these vectoring systems between the different service providers. So that means that we can't have unbundling anymore, right? We have to go back to the old system where we own everything. Not true. With software-defined networks today, you can, in fact, in software, act almost as if you owned the connection right down to the physical layer instead of cut and reconnect unbundling that we saw in the 1990s. That can all be done in software today, right down to that level, and you can set up virtual links as part of software-defined network. Now, this has to be open and done in a way that encourages competition, but I believe it will be a major part of it's really the only future technical way forward to deal with the competition issue. And so MIMO does not necessarily prevent, with software-defined networks, competition, which is sometimes alleged. Internet access. So how do you measure systems? Where can problems be in a core network, the access network, the home network, elsewhere? Well, the closer you get to the consumer, the more likely you are to have problems. We have an app. You can download it for free. You can run it here at the conference. It's called Cloud Check. What it does is it measures your Wi-Fi connection, your broadband speed, your connection to a server you designate. It shows YouTube here. Is there a problem? Can it be fixed? This is free. Can it be fixed automatically? Does somebody want to pay for it? Do they need new equipment? So forth. These types of measurements, I just want to give you an idea looking at this. And I did two different systems, the Euclid speed test everyone's familiar with, this more new type of speed measurement. I actually have one of my homes is in Paris. I have a fiber connection there. They advertise very high speeds. And unfortunately, this is the sharing stability problem here. You can see pretty clearly on both sets of measurements done a year apart. One was done in the afternoon, and later in the afternoon, you can see I'm only getting a few megabits per second on my fiber connection. If you look at the lower, a year ago, this app wasn't available, so I just got a single measurement. But you can see that on Sunday night when I was trying to watch the NFL in the United States over the NFL Europe package, I was only getting 2.5 megabits per second. I couldn't watch. My old DSL ran at 6 megabits per second. The next morning at 7 a.m. when nobody's on the system, I'm getting 90 megabits per second. So just putting a fiber in doesn't necessarily solve the problem. Is the connection fair? All these things have to be measured in order to understand. And then optimized and addressed. So optimization, whether you're repairing or repairing with help or automatically trying to manage connections, what's the level of improvement on the stability with these techniques? Here's actually a report from the UK regulator Ofcom on stability across the various service providers. The bottom two here, the purple one is actually a managed DSL system from Bölcskei. It's the only one in the UK, basically, that uses these techniques. The red line is DOCSIS 3.0, brand new DOCSIS network from Virgin Media there. You can see those two are close, and everyone else is up at much higher levels in terms of consumer complaints that are reported in the UK to the regulator. And this type of speed advantage, as we go to MIMO and so forth, is going to be, or it's kind of complaint advantage is going to be important at higher speeds. A lot of this is related to this cocktail party effect. You have too many people in the room sharing the spectrum, whether it's wired or wireline, and they start hearing one another and they're trying to talk over one another, and eventually you have a catastrophe. Now, the solution, of course, is for everyone to talk at a low level, and that allows productive communications between all the people in the cocktail party. And that's how these management systems work. How much does it mean to consumers? Here's just some measurements. These are from real consumers in the field that are having problems before and after, March and April this year. Are you satisfied with your internet connection before and after? More than a factor of 2 reduction after these techniques go into use. Most service providers are happy with a 5% improvement in this number, so more than a factor of 2 is outstanding. Here's an indication of Wi-Fi speeds down here at the bottom, if I can get my clicker to work. There we go. Before and after. This is with the latest, greatest, biggest suppliers of best chips and devices, access points, before and after, in terms of speed distribution inside about 10,000 homes in a neighborhood, actually, that I can't say where it is in the world. And you can see the management is pretty important, or the optimization, even with the multiple antennas, which were in fact being used there. So many itineraries. Let's suppose we look at the consumer out there, multiple pass into the homes. They can have one big fat pipe in, or they have multiple pipes in, maybe 1 gigabit on the fast pipe if it's an EPON. Maybe if you have 100 megabit per second connections, you get 2 gigabits. You can peak up to 1 gigabit per second on the first system. You can only peak up to 100 on the second system. But what you have is these overlapping Wi-Fi systems, which I said if they're managed, you can eliminate the interference. If you manage them enough, you can actually exploit it and start to use multiple SSIDs and take advantage of that full bandwidth that's into the building or the neighborhood, if you will, of 2 gigabits per second. So furthermore, if you look at the and this is, I'll take a shot at the 802.11ac standard that's just coming out. I say they made a mistake. I made a huge mistake. 2.4 gigahertz had 3 channels. Okay, the reason for introducing 5 gigahertz was to go to 20 channels. And they immediately in 802.11c bonded 8 of them together so they could get 5 gigabit speeds that they could send around the home. What does that do if you're using 5 gigabits at 8 channels? Well, 20 divided by 8. I'm back to 3 channels again. So as these systems proliferate, they all start colliding with one another. You're back to the point where you don't have enough bandwidth because it's not being managed. So the point of this slide is simply to say use space, use frequency, use it more carefully, manage it statistically, and you can do a much better job. But you don't need to send 5 gigabits around the home if your internet connection is running at 100 megabits back. So again, MIMO is good, but we need to use it appropriately. Let me just give you an example. If you had 3 Wi-Fis and they're all running at 100 megabits, you get 300 megabit per second connection. If you can share a bit, even better, you can get gigabits per second if you have shorter copper and faster Wi-Fis. But the consumers would probably be pretty happy with the first option up there. So my final slide here is there's about 1.3 billion phone line connections globally. About half of them are internet enabled. That's 1 billion antennas out there. You could take advantage of them. So my point is that multiple itineraries makes opportunity. It really is the point behind this. It happens at the antenna level. It also happens at a higher level, and it extends basically all of the existing infrastructure, the spectrum, the copper we already have in place. You can get hundreds of megabits per second to everybody. So maybe this is the real ultra massive MIMO in terms of internet connectivity in the future. So thank you.
Well, it's a lot of good stuff there. You know, it occurs to me that when we go home, we're all our own system administrators. You know, you can sit in the office and do equations, and it looks great, and you get home and you turn on your Wi-Fi and says, damn it, why can't I get better connectivity here, you know, and you ask all your friends, you know, how do you get this to work better in your home, and, you know, and there's so many different things that you've got, so many things going on here. It's a very varied and complex world. Anyway, we got to move right along, and our next speaker, Helmut Bölcskei, and I tried that earlier, and he said, you better just call me Helmut. So he has a Stanford connection like the other two, the first 2 speakers we had. You had a postdoc there for a while, I guess, at Stanford, and he's at the University of Illinois, and now he's in Zurich, and in fact, at a school where their most famous faculty member is sitting on a bench out in front of the building here. Albert Einstein, in case you haven't seen it, it's a great statue. But anyway, ETH or ETH is where he presently is at. Anyway, you're up.
Thank you, Bob. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. First question, do we have a new clicker, or do I have to? If not, maybe we can agree that every time I do this, you move forward, and if I do this, you move backward. All right, good. Okay, so Paul asked me to talk a little bit about the mathematics of MIMO, and I'd like to show you what the key problems are from a mathematical point of view in getting spatial multiplexing work. So Paul nicely explained that the basic idea is to send independent data streams using multiple transmit antennas, and then provided there is rich enough scattering, the receiver can take apart or separate those streams and decode, and that gives you n-fold capacity increase as shown by Jerry Foschini in 1996. So there are 2 questions or 2 problems here really. The first one is, does the channel really provide these gains in reality, or is this fiction? The models that are typically used are IID fading models, so of course we know that we don't get that in practice. And the second problem is on the receiver side, what's the complexity incurred in taking apart these vector signals? And I would like to address the latter one. But before I do that, if we look a little bit at systems level simulations and try to convince ourselves that indeed the channel that we see in practice offers those spatial multiplexing gains. So what you can see here is a systems level simulation of a Wi-Fi system, 40 megahertz bandwidth. And you see actually the throughput as a function of range for a single stream, a 2-stream and 4-stream system. And you indeed see that the peak throughput increases twofold in going from 1 to 2 antennas, and another twofold from going from 2 to 4 antennas. Likewise, you could say that if you fix the throughput, you get a range increase for using multiple antennas, and you get better quality of service and higher system capacity. That's something that I believe Tom Marzetta will be talking about, these aspects. So the answer is yes, we do get these spatial multiplexing gains. The channels that we see in nature, they offer those gains, which leaves us with the second question, namely the decoder complexity. So what does the decoder have to do? And for the experts, I use the word decoding actually for detection here, and I didn't want to separate those to keep it simple. So you see that the received vector y is the result of applying the channel h to the transmit vector plus some noise. And what the optimum receiver, the maximum likelihood receiver, has to do is it has to take the received vector y. It knows the channel h, so that's a standing assumption. The transmitter doesn't need to know the channel, the receiver knows it. And then it has to go through all possible transmit vectors, and there's many of them, and I'll show you on the next slide how many, and evaluate this norm, the difference between the vector y and the vector h times s. So the brute force implementation of such a receiver would be to take all possible s vectors and compute those norms, and then take the minimum and then declare the corresponding vector as the vector that was transmitted. And moreover, this is only half the story. What you also have to do is you have to extract soft information or reliability information. You want to know how reliable your decoded bits are. How probable is it that the bits that you decoded are the correct bits, the bits that were transmitted. And in order to do that, you need to rerun the operation that I just described, namely evaluating these norms here. For typically, if you have, let's say, a 64 QAM constellation, 4 antennas, you would have to run this 24 times. So really, this is an operation that the one that I just described, that you have to run, not once, but let's say, 20, 50, or 100 times. So if you try to implement that and do it via exhaustive search, this is what you get. What you see on the leftmost picture is a chip that was built in the course of a student project at ETH in collaboration with the Institute for Integrated Systems. And that chip is a full-fledged 11N physical layer with a very simple receiver, far from the optimum receiver. Namely, it's a MMSE or channel inversion-based receiver. I'll be talking about that in a second. And you see the gate count, and you see the area. That's 130 nanometer technology, so that's what we use for student projects. And you see in going from 2x2 to 3x3 and 4x4, the gate count and the corresponding chip area. And of course, if you scale down the technology, this gets smaller, but you still understand that it's huge. That you would need in just running this optimization problem once. So clearly, 2x2 is still feasible. 3x3 gets to be very challenging or already impossible, and 4x4 there's no question. And of course, we talk about up to 8x8 systems. And that's just for running this optimization problem once. And then if you have to extract soft information, you can actually multiply the chip area, because you have to do this many times, 20, 50, up to 100 times. So the question is, or the problem statement is, exhaustive search is out of the question. Is there something more intelligent we can do? And of course, before we convince ourselves that there is a need to do something more intelligent, let's look at the leftmost figure has a channel inversion-based receiver underlying. Let's see why that would not be as satisfactory in practice. And the receiver idea is very simple. You take the channel, you compute the inverse, so you undo the action of the channel, and you compute the reliability information very easily because you have separated the streams, so you do it on a scalar by scalar subchannel basis. And the advantage of this receiver is that complexity is low, even for a very large number of streams, so it scales very nicely. However, and that's something that John addressed in his talk before, your user is not going to be happy if the user experience depends very much on the location. If you look at the leftmost picture, you see the signal level as a function of the location. And if it varies drastically depending on where you sit in the conference room, or if the performance varies drastically over time. And what you see here on the left figure is the 4 spatial streams that you extract through this channel inversion-based receiver, as opposed to the optimum receiver on the right picture. And you see the signal level fluctuation for this MMSC receiver is significant, simply because we do not get any diversity, concept that Paul nicely explained in his talk. Whereas in the ML receiver, you do get full diversity gain and full spatial multiplexing gain. Well, it's the optimum receiver, but it's very costly to implement. So the bottom line is the performance of this suboptimum receiver that we can implement very easily and at a decent gate count exhibits significant sensitivity to propagation conditions, antenna characteristics, and interference. And as we know, user experience is very important. So that's something we would like to avoid, and we would like to have a stable solution, but a stable solution is costly in terms of gate count or chip area. So that leads us to asking the question, what is the structure, the mathematical structure of the underlying decoding problem? And that leads to a very interesting concept that was developed in the early 1980s. I will talk about it shortly, by a pure mathematician from Berlin. The basic insight is the following. If you transmit from a finite signal constellation, and this is indicated on the leftmost figure here, you have 4 antennas, let's say, you're transmitting what is called lattice points. And the channel applied to the transmit vector skews the lattice, and what you receive is not a point on the skewed lattice, because you also have noise in the receiver. So you see actually this point that is somewhere off the lattice. And now imagine this in very high dimensional space, many, many dimensions. I mean, this here, of course, we are restricted to 2 dimensions. And then you're trying to find the closest lattice point in this high dimensional space. So that's the decoding problem. There has been or there was developed, as I said, in the early 1980s, an algorithm to efficiently identify the closest point in an infinite lattice by a mathematician from Berlin, Michael Post is his name. It took about a decade or so for Viterbo and Bilieri to realize that the Post algorithm could be applied to finite lattice decoding. Finite meaning that the lattice is no longer infinite size, but finite, and there's some wraparound effects and so on that have to be taken into account for non-fading channels. Viterbo and Boutros employed this idea for fading channels, and as you can imagine, the skewed lattice, the lattice changes a lot depending on the channel realizations. That's something we have to cope with in wireless, and Dahmen was the first to describe the application to space-time code decoding. In terms of the application to MIMO, Hochwald and ten Brink, and Bert Hochwald is here, just realized that he is in the audience, proposed a list sphere decoder. So they proposed, the basic idea was to use the Post algorithm to do decoding in MIMO systems. Andy Burke was the one who did the first VLSI implementation, and in 2008, Christoph Studer et al. Developed an idea that can very easily be described in a sentence, namely that you want to do decoding and compute soft information, and you do it in one shot. Essentially, there is a tree search problem underlying the Post algorithm, and what you do is, in one shot, you try to decode, and while pruning the tree, you also extract the soft information. So that's the basic idea of what is called single tree search sphere decoding. And that has been extended also to iterative decoding. So let's see if single tree search sphere decoding is implementable. So what you see here is, again, the setup for a Wi-Fi system that would run at 600 megabits per second for the megahertz channel. And you see on the left figure the channel version-based receiver. Of course, it's much smaller gate count, but if you look at the right-hand figure, that's the full physical layer chip. You see that the chip is somewhat bigger, but really, of course, it's many more gates. But if the size comparison that we look at here, I mean, if you look at nowadays sizes of cell phones and so on, that's not an issue. And what VLSI designers are concerned with is typically that the performance of the algorithm is somehow proportional to the energy consumption, and the post-sphere decoding algorithm has exactly that property. So the bottom line is, the message is that this is doable, you can implement this in practice, you can get the optimum performance, and this maximum likelihood detector, it simply extracts whatever is best possible out of a given channel. So yes, you will have variations in terms of user experience, depending on the location and as a function of time, but the algorithm gives you whatever the channel offers you. And you're not going to be subject to variations because of a suboptimal algorithm. The final frontier is iterative decoding, where you run through your algorithm, compute reliability information, you feed back reliability information, and you do the same thing again. And the idea is to improve the estimates and improve the decoding quality. So what you see here is a frame error rate as a function of SNR for what is called a hard output sphere decoder, so the brown curve here, that's just what the post algorithm straight would give you. Then if you compute reliability information, that's the green curve, you gain about 3.5 dB. And if you do iterative decoding, you end up with the red curve here, that's 4 iterations, and the blue curve is the fundamental limit that information theory tells us you cannot surpass. So you see that iterative decoding is something that can bring us very close to the fundamental limit. The question is that feasible in practice? Because now you have to compute the hard outputs of the decoding problem, compute the reliability information, then you have to feed that back into the same thing all over again. And in fact, it is doable. And here is the first implementation of a single input, of a soft input, soft output, single research sphere decoder. This chip was built by a group from Aachen around Heinrich Meyer, Filippo Borlenghi, and Emanuel Witte. And you see actually a photo of part of the chip that has a detector and the LDPC decoder on it. And what you see in the left figure is measurements of the coded systems throughput as a function of SNR. So these are SNR values that you indeed get in a Wi-Fi system. And you see that indeed we can get up to a gigabit per second at realistic SNR values. And the chip size is such that it's absolutely within the boundaries of what is reasonable. Good, so wrapping up, I think it was mentioned several times before, massive MIMO, we have possibly hundreds of streams. The channel will be close to orthogonal, so that is going to take care of self-interference, and that is going to solve a number of these practical problems that we have, and I believe Tom will be talking about that. Sphere decoding, I would say, is good for systems up to 6x6 or 8x8, and then we need something new, something fundamentally new probably, because still complexity is an issue. It becomes an issue if you exceed 8x8 systems and you have very high bandwidth. The question is well, wide open, and it's not clear what kind of receivers to use. Distributed MIMO, Paul mentioned, is a future challenge, significant. And MIMO for other transmission media, there's a lot of effort. And actually, Jerry Foschini, Peter Winzer, and people at Bell Labs are leading the effort in doing MIMO for fiber optic channels. So that's a very hot topic. And on that note, I would like to close. And I would like to let you know that if you ask me anything I don't know, I'm certainly not going to answer. Thank you very much.
Yeah, beautiful stuff. Thanks so much. Our last speaker is Tom Marzetta, who hails from my old stamping grounds at Bell Labs. It's Alcatel-Lucent Bell Labs now. He's a refugee from the famous mathematical research area there. That area no longer exists, but he's been working in massive MIMO, and we welcome you here. And you have no Stanford connection, I think.
No, I don't. I'm an East Coast boy.
Okay, you're up top.
So I'd like to thank Dr. Lucky for the honor of being here. First of all, if you notice, I took the liberty of adding an extra 0 in this title The proponents of massive MIMO really do believe that they have a revolutionary technology on their hands. And some of the good benefits of massive MIMO have been mentioned, but in general you can summarize it as 4 things: speed, scalability, simplicity, uniformly good service. Next slide, please. So, people have done all sorts of projections about what wireless engineers must do in coming years, but they're probably all wrong, because no matter how much throughput is created, there are going to be exciting new applications coming along that will chew it all up. And so, no one ever anticipated, I think 10 years ago, that young people would be constantly sending snapshots back and forth, selfies, video clips, and so on. One can anticipate maybe 5 or 10 years from now in, say, Times Square, hundreds of thousands of people are going to be wanting to, for perhaps no good reason at all, send 3D HD video back and forth to their friends continuously. So how are you going to provide this sort of throughput in a crowded environment? Next slide, please. Massive MIMO is, I think, the solution. So let's just contrast point-to-point MIMO with massive MIMO. So here we have, of course, an antenna array, say at the base station. We do some complicated pre-coding. Here we have an array at the receiver. The user has to do some complicated decoding. And now let's put some numbers. So 802.11ac permits in the latest standards 8x8 MIMO with 160 megahertz spectral bandwidth. So if we assume that we do 8x8 point-to-point MIMO and that we have a SINR at the receiver of -0.5 dB, we actually can send 1 gigabit per second to this user. I mean, this is a tribute to the brilliance of the original massive or point-to-point MIMO concept. But if you inspect this a little more closely, it's apparent you're really pushing point-to-point MIMO to an extreme here. For one thing, this -0.5 dB SNR sounds very low, but actually it might be even lower on the cell edges. Another thing is, most of the work in this system is being done by these 8 receive antennas. These 8 transmit antennas are redundant to a great extent. So if I go to 4x8, 4 transmit antennas, this 1 gigabit throughput's only reduced by 15% to about 850 megabits, okay? If I go down to 4 transmit antennas, it's reduced to, you lose about 35–40%. So the point is, you're not really sending more than 3 independent streams, and you're pushing it to extremes. And you're asking also the propagation environment to support multiple streams. 3 may be okay, but if you tried to boost the SNR and get 8, not clear you can do it. So massive MIMO instead, of course, notice all of the complexities at the base station. These users simply don't do anything. They don't have to do any processing, and this is part of the simplicity. And just for fun, I said let's give 8 users each 1 gigabit per second instead of 1 user 1 gigabit per second. And so with somewhat over 600 antennas, you can do the job. This is probably a poor use of massive MIMO, because the question is, why do you need 1 gigabit per second per user? So it would make a great deal of sense to throttle back their throughputs, add many more users, and overall you'll get a considerable increase in total throughput. Next slide, please. So massive MIMO is more than just a large number of antennas, but here, for instance, is a mock-up of a 64-element array. These are half wavelength by half wavelength patch antennas on half wavelength centers horizontally, 1 wavelength vertically. This whole thing could fit in your overhead baggage on an airplane. So these things don't have to be physically big. And I'll show you later on what you can accomplish with this modest number of antennas. So what are the other components of massive MIMO? Well, one of them is, of course, that you're doing this aggressive multiplexing, so every one of the users is continually having access to all of the time frequency cells. This is the component of simplicity. Point-to-point or LTE fusses around a great deal with trying to tile up the time frequency plane in some semi-optimal fashion. Because of its complexity and the lack of CSI, LTE has just been a delightful research field for scheduling researchers, for example. Massive MIMO really doesn't call for all of that at all. The third component of massive MIMO is that this beamforming, this sending of independent message streams selectively to the users, is accomplished with measured channel characteristics rather than assumed channel characteristics. So if you apply these three criteria, and actually many of the things that masquerade as massive MIMO fall short. Next slide, please. So how is massive MIMO done? Well, here we have our transmit array, antenna 1 through antenna M. Here we have K users, single antenna users. And here we have QAM symbols, message-bearing symbols, Q1 through QK, intended for number 1 through number K. And notice each antenna participates in the transmission of all of these K message symbols. The simplest sort of conjugate beamforming, which is the downlink counterpart to the old matched filter, antenna 1 takes QAM symbol 1 and weights it by the conjugate of its channel estimate to user 1. And does the same for each of the K symbols, adds them together, transmits. What this ensures is that this Q1 transmission from each of these antennas arrives in phase at user 1 and out of phase elsewhere. So you have constructive interference at user 1, destructive interference elsewhere. And it's exceedingly simple and works exceedingly well. I'll show you later what it can do. Next slide, please. Why do we make such a big deal of measured channel characteristics rather than assumed channel characteristics? It's because measured channel characteristics makes the system scalable. Using assumed channel characteristics, the system is not scalable. So what do we mean more precisely? So there are various modes under both Wi-Fi and under LTE where I can actually do multi-user MIMO. The way it's done, one of the ways, is you have an array, you form open loop orthogonal beams, you transmit a downlink pilot through each beam, and each user reports back which beam works best for him. Now for a while that will work, but it's not scalable because inevitably there's two ways it goes wrong. One is eventually the beam width of these open loop beams becomes narrower than the angle spread of the medium. So there's now a mismatch between the assumed channel characteristic and the actual channel characteristic. And in that regime, you only are getting logarithmic improvements in beamforming gain with number of antennas. And so the other thing is, even if it were a completely zero angle spread line of sight medium, as you make the antenna bigger and bigger, the phase synchronization precision between antenna elements has to get successively better and better. You have to know more and more accurately their relative positions. Any sort of mutual coupling will start to throw things off. So when I explain massive MIMO for the first time to RF engineers, many of them get very nervous at the thought of how you can possibly phase together hundreds or thousands of antennas and make them work together. And I patiently explain, no, that isn't what you do in massive MIMO. You're using a measured channel characteristics. You don't need phase synchronization. You don't even need to know where the antennas are. Next slide, please. TDD is what is really needed as opposed to FDD in order to learn the channel when you have mobile users. So if the users are moving, you estimate the channel and then you use the channel. If you wait too long, this channel information is out of date and you just don't get the beamforming gains. So typically you have to do everything in a slot in which nobody moves more than, say, a quarter wavelength. All right? Well, with TDD training, you're relying on, of course, reciprocity, the downlink channels being equal to the uplink channels. The burden is just proportional to the number of users. You're just transmitting uplink pilots. With FDD, you have to transmit downlink pilots proportional to the number of antennas. You have to send this back, and you still have to learn the uplink channel. So if you compare the two, you see TDD permits as many base station antennas as you want and a large number of users. FDD, you're confined to this little triangular region there. So now there are a lot of people doing brilliant research on how to break the back of this. Typically they make some assumptions about the propagation in order to streamline the CSI acquisition. Undoubtedly this is going to work to some extent, but nobody has yet shown that their solution is really scalable. Next slide. Let's see what we can do in a dense urban multicellular environment. I'm deliberately making it a very modest number of antennas, 64, so each base station in the cell has 64 antennas serving 18 randomly distributed users per cell. So we'll assume 2 gigahertz, 500 meter cell, a slot of 2 milliseconds. Remember, in this slot we do 3 activities. First, uplink data. Second, uplink pilots. Third, downlink data. And we roughly split up the slot into thirds for that. That permits actually high mobility, 70 kilometers per hour, which is rather fast. We'll assume 20 megahertz TDD spectral bandwidth. The total downlink radiated power is 1 watt. This goes back to John's party phenomenon. The way to make your people heard in a party is everybody reduce their power. Well, the best way to deal with intercell interference is, guess what? Reduce the power. So we're reducing the power from a typical 120 watts radiated down to 1 watt radiated down per cell. So what sort of user experience do we get? Well, the extraordinary thing is a 95% likely per user throughput of 5 megabits down, 4 megabits per second up. This is even on the cell edges. So no other system can do this. And in point of fact, the poor performance of LTE on the cell edges has, of course, motivated this mania for small cell deployments to make up for these defects. If you use massive MIMO, the only reason you might want to have some small cells is if someone wants some extraordinarily high throughput, is willing to move to some little kiosk and get special service. Finally, massive MIMO is automatically a green sort of technology. Without even working at it, you can do 500 times the energy efficiency of today's LTE base stations. Next slide, please. This merely shows how that power control is very important for massive MIMO. Black is powered control, red is just equal power to each user. And in point of fact, on downlink, you see that our median throughput is about, 8 megabits per second, and the 95% likely throughput is on the order of 5 megabits per second. That's a very flat curve. Power control is even more important on the uplink. The interesting thing is that our 95% uplink throughput is only reduced slightly by 20% below downlink. Okay, next slide, please. I just want to finish with just some common misconceptions about massive MIMO. In fact, I'm working on a paper with some colleagues at Linköping University that we're going to call 12 Myths of Massive MIMO. I'm not going to go through these. I hope I've given you enough insight that you can refute these myths yourself. If not, please contact me and I'll be happy to help you out. Thank you.
You know, Marconi, when he invented radio, he had a spark transmitter, and it just dumped a pulse of energy across the whole band. And then for a receiver, he had a coherer, you know, that just, the iron filings would cling together and cohere. And that was it. I wonder if he was sitting in this audience this morning and watching what happened. What have you done to this? It's incredible and beautiful, and this has been, I think, a unique opportunity for experts in the field who gave very clear talks at the conceptual level, and I think this is an unusual thing to have and very valuable session. So I really thank you all. You did a wonderful job, and I learned a lot, and I hope the audience did too. Now I'm faced with the question of whether we should have questions or whether we should have coffee. Normally, I would say we should have some time for questions, but given the group here, I think the ability to do some collegial interaction over the coffee is more important than having a few fake questions that might come up at this time. So I'd just like to thank the speakers again, and if you have questions, please ask these guys over coffee. Thanks for listening.